It was meant to become the Soviet answer to the entire Western car industry, and surprisingly, it did. In the mid-1980s, engineers in Togliatti proved they could build cars that were modern, fast, and even beautiful. In its class of front-wheel drive hatchbacks, it came remarkably close to global benchmarks like the Volkswagen Golf and Ford Escort, though of course, at a much lower price. Inside the USSR, it became the most desired car of the decade. In this video, the story of perhaps the most successful and recognizable Soviet automobile, the Lada Samara. You'll learn what helped it stay on the assembly line for so many years, the surprising role Porsche played in its creation, and why, in the 1990s, it turned from a symbol of progress into a symbol of a far more dangerous era. In the mid-1970s, things were going well for the Lada brand. Its cars were in steady demand both inside the Soviet Union and abroad. But within the company's leadership, one idea was becoming impossible to ignore. The future belonged to front-wheel drive. The trend across the global industry confirmed it. Almost every manufacturer producing cars in the same class as Lada was switching to front-wheel drive platforms. Even Fiat, the closest technical partner Lada ever had, was moving firmly in that direction. By that time, however, the cooperation between the two companies was coming to an end. And here the story becomes complicated. Some sources claim that Fiat refused to extend the partnership, not wanting a potential competitor from the Soviet Union on the European market. Others insist that Fiat did not refuse at all, and instead tried to push Lada toward a design similar to the Polish Polonaise, which itself was based on the rear-wheel drive Fiat 125. And that proposal clearly didn't suit the Soviet side. Which version is true? It depends on whom you ask. Each side tells the story in its own favor. But one thing is certain. By 1976, the paths of Fiat and Lada had diverged. The decision was made. Lada would develop its front-wheel drive car on its own. By that time, the engineers in Togliatti already had some experience in this field. Back in the early 1970s, they had built a whole series of prototypes with front-wheel drive. Although visually, none of them resembled what would later become the Samara. The final exterior design took shape on a sketch by Vladislav Pashko in 1978. And on December 31st of that same year, the first full-scale prototype was completed, a car that already looked almost identical to the future production model. For its time, the prototype had all the features of a modern automobile. A transverse engine layout, independent suspension, a negative scrub radius for the front wheels, rack and pinion steering, front disc brakes with a floating caliper, electronic ignition, integrated plastic bumpers, very fashionable in those days, and molded one-piece interior panels. Since Lada did not have the authority to approve mass production on its own, the prototype was shown to the members of the Central Committee. On May 29, 1979, the Council of Ministers issued Resolution number 470 on the development and introduction of a family of front-wheel drive cars at the Togliatti automobile plant. And before we return to the Samara, let's settle one of the most debated topics right away. The Porsche connection is not a myth. Engineers from Porsche's development division really did work on the car's handling and stability, and provided recommendations on the body, suspension, and engine. What's interesting is that Soviet-German cooperation began not with the Samara, and not even with Lada, but with the Moskvich. By the mid-1970s, the Moskvich 412 could no longer be called hopelessly outdated, but it was not modern either. It had reached the point where it needed either a deep modernization or an entirely new generation. But the Moskvich plant found itself in a difficult position. It had capable engineers, people who could design a new car. But after the appearance of Lada, the factory slipped into the background in terms of funding and priority, which meant that creating a brand new model was impossible. Only a modernization was realistic. So work began on two fronts: improvements done inside the plant and searching for foreign partners who could assist with the redesign. And the Moskvich engineers didn't aim low. They approached Porsche directly. And Porsche agreed. Of course, not for free. The result of Porsche engineering's work is what you're looking at now. Remarkably, the Germans approached the task very conservatively. The exterior changed only slightly. The grille became cleaner and less chromed. The trunk lid received a Moskvich badge, styled in Porsche's own typography. And the rear panel lost its reflectors in favor of a space for a long, European-style license plate. The interior was also updated. The new steering wheel immediately stands out. Its shape echoes the wheel designs used on Porsche sports cars of that era. The attempted cooperation between Moskvich and Porsche resulted in what can only be described as a curious episode. According to eyewitness accounts, the Soviet Minister of Automotive Industry, Polyakov, became extremely displeased when, in 1975, Pavel Taranenko, the deputy chief designer at Moskvich, returned from a trip to Porsche with a thick folder of proposals on how to modernize the 412 model. "How is this even possible?" Polyakov reportedly exclaimed. "This is a blatant violation of hierarchy. Matters of this level must be decided by the ministry, not by factory employees." Porsche, of course, had no understanding of the peculiarities of Soviet bureaucratic hierarchy. So a meeting was quickly arranged in Moscow between Polyakov and Porsche's president, Dr. Ernst Fuhrmann. It was this meeting that led to a long-term cooperation, but not with Moskvich, with Lada. Moskvich, meanwhile, had to modernize its car on its own, eventually producing the model 2140. Ernst Fuhrmann, Porsche's president at the time, stated publicly that his company's cooperation with the Soviet Union was motivated by a desire, as he put it, to compensate, at least in some way, for the damage Germany had inflicted on the USSR during the Second World War. He repeated this reasoning more than once, and first mentioned it during his meeting with Polyakov in 1975. A noble sentiment, no doubt, but beyond the humanitarian tone, there was also a very real financial component. The 4-year program cost the Soviet side around 500,000 Deutschmarks per year, which is roughly equivalent to $1.3 million in 2025 terms. The agreement included the development of a gasoline engine capable of operating on ultra-lean mixtures, a proposed facelift for the Lada 2103, and assistance in refining the future Samara. A permanent group of Lada specialists, designers, body engineers, and engine engineers, also worked on site at Porsche. However, much like in the Moskvich case, Porsche's proposed update for the 2103 was ultimately rejected in favor of the plant's own modernization, which later became the Lada 2106. The project received the codename Gamma. The agreement was signed in Stuttgart on January 8, 1980. Officially, Porsche's assistance covered only the 3-door Lada 2108 with the 1.3-liter engine, although the engineers in Tolyatti were simultaneously developing the entire family, including the 5-door version and the 1.1 and 1.5-liter engines. Several early prototypes of what would later become the Samara were built and, together with Soviet engineers, sent to the German town of Weissach, home to Porsche's test facility. By the autumn of 1980, Porsche specialists were already proposing changes to the engine design and working on the handling characteristics of the future 2108, testing it directly on the Weissach track. They also recommended a number of components for which Lada later purchased licenses. These licensed parts included the front suspension struts, the design of the rear axle beam, the radiator, the carburetor, and the window regulators. From Michelin, Lada acquired the license and production equipment for manufacturing tubeless radial tires with steel belts, sized 165/70 R13. It is also worth mentioning Porsche's chief designer, Anatol Lapin. Originally from Riga, he spoke Russian reasonably well, which greatly simplified communication with the Soviet engineers. According to rumors, it was Lapin who insisted that the Samara should have traditional door handles rather than push-button latches, which had been part of the original design. An interesting detail? At the same time, the Porsche engineering division was also working for the Spanish company Seat, refining a very similar car, the Seat Ibiza hatchback. And in its exterior, you can indeed notice elements that resemble the Samara: the shape of the B-pillar, the design of the door handles, and several other proportions. Unlike the Soviet engineers, the Spanish side did not hesitate to highlight the cooperation. The Ibiza proudly carried a System Porsche script on the valve cover, a detail that clearly boosted the car's image in the eyes of potential buyers. The Soviet approach was different. Most likely, the priority was pure practicality rather than marketing. Porsche specialists were needed to perfect the car's balance and handling, while promotion and brand appeal were secondary considerations. Soviet newspapers mentioned Porsche's role only briefly and without enthusiasm, always stressing that the Germans worked exclusively on refinement rather than on the actual design of the car. This was not entirely untrue. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when everything Western became fashionable, Porsche's involvement in the Samara project began to be emphasized much more frequently. It was then that the car gained its informal reputation of having a Porsche gene, at least in terms of its driving characteristics. But it would be wrong to think that the refinement of the car was handled only by the Germans. Extensive testing was also carried out in the Soviet Union, and on a far larger scale than in Germany. The result of one such test is what you're seeing on the screen now. The scene captured in this photograph caused quite a few headaches for the Lada engineers. Even within the ministries, let alone the lower levels, there were strong supporters of rear-wheel drive who rejected the very idea of a front-wheel drive layout. To them, developing a front-wheel drive hatchback was a waste of effort. They insisted that the fashion for such cars would soon pass, while rear-wheel drive would remain the only proper solution. And an image showing a torn-off rear axle beam only strengthened their arguments. At first, this photograph circulated only among specialists. But once it appeared in the press, skepticism spread quickly among ordinary citizens as well. In simple terms, public opinion could be summed up as follows. Rear-wheel drive Ladas were built like tanks, while the new front-wheel drive model seemed fragile and unsuitable for bad roads. Series production of the Lada 2108, known on the domestic market as the Sputnik, began on August 22, 1984. The same day it was shown to government officials, and its first public presentation took place in September 1984. After that debut, the skeptics fell silent. It became clear to everyone. The car was a success. The first retail Sputniki reached dealerships in the winter of 1985. Early production cars used many imported components because not everything licensed for production had yet been localized. As a result, the first batches came with Swedish glass and Michelin tires. The price was 8,500 rubles, the highest among all cars realistically available to ordinary Soviet citizens, except for the Volga. Technically, a Volga could end up in private hands. Practically, it was almost science fiction, which meant that the Sputnik became the top car an ordinary person could realistically hope to own. It's also important to remember that car buying queues at the time could reach 10 years. I've covered this in detail in another video. If you haven't seen it yet, do check it out. And by that logic, the first Sputniki should have reached their buyers only in the mid-90s. But enterprise queues worked differently. Workers signed up, and each factory received a small annual allocation of cars, usually 5 to 10 units. Which exact cars would arrive became known only at the moment of delivery. It was essentially a lottery. One year, the allocation might include mustard-colored Zaporozhets cars. The next, a reasonably respectable Moskvich. Nobody knew what they would get when their turn finally came. And so the first Sputniki began appearing in enterprise allocations. It's hard to overstate the joy of those who won such a car. It really was like planning to buy an Opel Corsa and ending up, by pure luck, with a Maserati instead. And that is not an exaggeration. The Sputnik surpassed every Soviet car of its era so dramatically that people genuinely perceived it that way. In 1986, the 5-door version debuted, strengthening the model's success and climbing even higher in the informal automotive hierarchy. But the Samara family also included a sedan, although its development history turned out to be somewhat complicated. Work on a front-wheel drive sedan began in Tolyatti in 1980. Initially, the plan was to use the same mechanical components as the Sputnik, but give the new model an entirely original design. The planned index was 2110. By 1983, however, the idea of a unique exterior had been abandoned. Full-size mock-ups showed clearly that the sedan styling was now based on the Sputnik. The first running prototypes appeared in 1984. They featured a front end that, unlike the hatchbacks, extended all the way to the edge of the bodywork, along with a redesigned radiator grille. By late 1985, the engineering work was complete, and the car was ready for official testing. But here, the creators resorted to a formal workaround. To shorten the testing procedure, the model's index was changed to 21099, which classified it as a modification of the five-door Lada 2109, and therefore allowed it to undergo a shorter test program. Even so, the process took years, and only in 1990 did the production Lada 21099 finally reach the assembly line. This is how the complete Samara family emerged: the three-door and five-door hatchbacks and the sedan. Soon after, the front-end design of the 99 migrated to the hatchbacks as well, giving the Sputnik lineup a facelift remarkably quickly, even by today's standards. Meanwhile, Soviet citizens continued waiting in endless queues, while the top priority remained the export of Lada cars. Once Lada entered Western markets, interest in the brand surged. From 76,500 cars exported in 1985 to 137,000 in 1986, the peak came in 1988, when Avto Export sold 157,000 Samaras abroad. The investment paid off. Up to 90% of all export revenue from Soviet automotive products came from the new Ladas. Cars shipped overseas were extensively reworked by Avto Export's partners. These included Skaldia Volga in Belgium, Deutsche Lada in Germany, Konala in Finland, and Sepma in France. The cars were repainted, the seats were retrimmed, Western electrical equipment was installed, and the wheels were fitted with imported tires. In Europe, the Lada Samara was priced at the level of cars from the class below, such as the Citroën AX, Fiat Panda, or Ford Fiesta, which made demand entirely natural. Foreign buyers also expected variety, and they got it. 3 engines, 1.1, 1.3, and 1.5 liters, 3 and 5-door hatchbacks, a 4-door sedan, and even the Natasha convertible. The Natasha underwent the most radical changes of the entire lineup. The project was carried out by the Brussels-based company Skaldia Volga. From the Soviet side, the designer Vladimir Yartsev took part. The same man, thanks to whom Mikhail Gorbachev, during his historic visit to the Lada plant on April 8, 1986, first learned that the profession of designer even existed, and rather naively wished the factory to become a global trendsetter. But the most extensive reworking of the Samara took place in Finland. Unlike most export Ladas, whose modifications were usually limited to exterior upgrades, the Lada Baltic was assembled locally using SKD kits. The assembly process was carried out with exceptional attention to quality. Body panels were carefully aligned, the cars were primed and repainted, and several components were replaced with imported ones. Finland also fitted the model with a fuel injection system. The result was a perfectly assembled, well-equipped version of the Samara, featuring a more comfortable interior and distinctive exterior styling. But all these improvements inevitably raised the price, and as a result, the Lada Baltic never achieved significant sales in Western Europe. In the Soviet Union itself, the late 1980s and early 90s brought increasingly difficult times, including for the Toyota automobile plant. And the problem wasn't declining demand or outdated models. By the early 90s, the Lada lineup still met the needs of most buyers. The real threat came from something entirely different: organized crime. After the collapse of the USSR, the level of criminal activity across the former republics rose to extreme, unprecedented heights. Every entrepreneur, from owners of small kiosks to managers of large factories, was forced to deal with criminal groups. The scheme worked like this. You are the owner of a small shop or workshop. A group of young men with a very characteristic appearance arrives and offers protection, a so-called krisha, or roof. This protection supposedly shielded the business from competitors, from other gangs, and from anyone else who might cause trouble. The price was usually around 50% of the business's income. Refusing was impossible. It could cost you both your livelihood and your life. Turning to the police was pointless. The authorities were unable to control the situation, and in many cases were influenced by the same criminal groups. As a result, nearly every business in Russia in the 90s had its own gang providing protection. It didn't matter whether it was a market stall or a major enterprise. The only difference was the scale. Larger factories simply received more respectable delegations. Naturally, a giant like the Tolyatti plant did not go unnoticed. Rival criminal groups fought a full-scale war for control of the factory, a conflict that lasted almost the entire decade. The stakes were enormous. Controlling the country's largest car manufacturer meant access to massive financial flows. And during the 90s, Tolyatti became arguably the most crime-ridden city in the entire post-Soviet space. It may seem surprising after everything we've discussed, but in the early 90s, the Lada Samara became strongly associated with the criminal world and developed a rather questionable reputation among ordinary people. The criminal hierarchy of that era had a very clear structure, including when it came to cars. Gang leaders drove Mercedes. The tier below preferred the Cherokee. Below them were those who used BMW 5 Series. And the lowest level, the people who carried out the dirty work, and often had the fewest moral constraints, drove Samaras. This was an unexpected twist in the car's story. Its creators certainly never imagined that one day it would gain the reputation of a gangster's car. But the reality was simple. If a Samara pulled up to your home or workplace, and four tough-looking men stepped out, nothing good was about to happen. Yet this association didn't destroy the model's image. In a strange way, it even increased the Samara's prestige. In the 90s, the criminal lifestyle was heavily romanticized. Songs, films, and pop culture glamorized the image, and many young people imitated the style and behavior of gang members, even if they never joined a gang themselves. The Lada Samara became part of that aesthetic. The most desirable colors were dark cherry metallic and a deep gray metallic shade known as wet asphalt. This may have helped the Samara survive the flood of used foreign cars that entered Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in the 90s. During that time, huge numbers of second-hand imports poured into the market. Moskvich models, rear-wheel drive Ladas, and especially the Zaporozhets, instantly lost any sense of prestige. But the Samara held its ground. Of course, it couldn't compete with Mercedes or BMW. Those belonged to a completely different category. But against the popular used imports of its own class, the Opel Ascona, Ford Sierra, Audi 80, or Renault 19, the Samara looked surprisingly competent. The violent struggle for control of the Tolyatti automobile plant effectively ended by 2001. By then, most criminal groups had been exhausted by years of conflict. Many of their leaders had been killed, and the last remaining factions were crushed when the government finally moved to restore order around the factory in the early 2000s. With some stretch, the only real winner of this criminal war was the well-known Boris Berezovsky. He built his first and very substantial fortune by becoming the first private dealer of Lada cars. At some point, Berezovsky realized that far greater profits could be made not by taking part in gang conflicts, but by rising above them, entering politics, and resolving his interests through political influence instead. Meanwhile, the factory itself continued operating despite all the difficulties it faced, and it even began developing a facelifted version of the Samara family, the model line that would become known as Samara 2. The very first mock-up of the updated design appeared back in 1993, representing a revised version of the three-door hatchback. In 1997, the first almost production version of the updated sedan appeared, carrying the Index 2115. It was assembled not on the main production line, but at the pilot industrial facility. It reached the main assembly line only in 2000, and a year later it was joined by the 2114, the updated version of the 2109. The introduction of the new models did not immediately replace the old ones. For some time, both generations were produced in parallel. Injector versions of the original Samara had already appeared in 1997, and even after Samara 2 went on sale, the earlier models remained relevant and continued to sell well. The Samara 2 lineup was received surprisingly warmly by the public. The refreshed design looked appropriate and did not provoke the usual embarrassment that often accompanies attempts to modernize a car from a different era. Its arrival allowed the original Samara to leave the production line gradually and gracefully, without becoming an outdated relic awkwardly dragged into the new decade. The successor modernized the exterior, improved the equipment slightly, remained affordable, and naturally took the old model's place. However, Samara 2 was no longer exported, just like the late versions of the original Samara. By that time, neither model could realistically compete in Western markets. But time moved on. In 2004, Russia introduced a law allowing only fuel-injected cars to be produced. Most early Samaras were still carbureted, so the first generation was retired, leaving only the injected Samara 2 on the main line. Even so, the model didn't disappear completely. In Ukraine and Kazakhstan, where such environmental rules did not yet apply, the Samara continued in semi-knockdown assembly until 2009. In Tolyatti, production of Samara 2 ended in December 2013, when the last 2114 rolled off the line. The decision was driven not so much by falling demand as by new emission standards and the need to free the line for the Lada Granta. In total, about 5.4 million Samaras were built, and the model stayed in production for nearly 30 years. And unlike many Soviet cars, it did not leave the stage as an outdated relic. Even at the end of its life, it remained a functional, relevant vehicle. Today, almost 40 years after it first appeared, the Samara is still a common, everyday car in former Soviet countries, with only early versions sought out by enthusiasts. Among younger drivers, it even enjoyed a second wave of popularity, thanks to its tuning potential. Sometimes all it needs is a clean set of wheels to look right. And in the end, the Samara remains one of the most successful Soviet cars ever built, a model with few controversies, no accusations of copying, and a unique identity. For many, it was their first real car, a symbol of two eras, and one of the very few Soviet designs recognized far beyond its homeland.